Hello, my friend. Today I bring you another lost legend from the depths of Middle-earth. Close your eyes, feel the magic surround you. Our journey begins. The Haunted Towers of Weathertop, a tale of the Third Age. Section 1. Shadowed Beginnings. In the days when the shadow first began to lengthen from the forest of Mirkwood, when the trees whispered of old fears newly awakened, there came a silence to the weather hills that had not been known since the foundations of Amon Sûl were laid in the glory of Arnor. The great watchtower that men called Weathertop stood sentinel still upon its weathered crown of stone. But the light that once burned eternal in its highest chamber had long since guttered to ash and memory. Autumn had come early to the wild lands between the Shire and Rivendell. The heather that carpeted the lower slopes burned russet and gold beneath a sky grown strange with premature twilight. And the ancient road that wound through the hills bore no travellers save the wind itself, which spoke in tongues that the elder days had known. It was a wind that carried more than the scent of dying leaves. It bore whispers of things stirring in places where stillness had reigned for centuries, uncounted. From the north came rumours on that restless air, tales told by the rangers who walked the lonely paths and watched from hidden places. They spoke of lights seen dancing in the ruins of Fornost, where no lights should be. They told of the barrow-wights growing bold beyond their ancient bounds, and of wolves running in packs beneath the pale moon, their eyes reflecting a cold fire that belonged to no natural flame. The trees themselves had begun to fail. Ancient oaks, whose roots had drunk deep of earth's strength for 1,000 years, withered without cause. The very stones of the old paths cracked and shifted, as though the foundations of the world grew uneasy beneath some pressure long contained, but now beginning to press upward from forgotten depths. Even the stars seemed dimmed, their ancient fire muted behind veils of cloud that gathered without reason and lingered without rain. At the foot of the tower's remaining wall, Gandalf paused and leaned upon his staff. The wood was carved with signs of power and protection, runes that gleamed faintly in the gathering dusk with their own inner light. For a long moment, he stood thus, listening not with his ears alone, but with senses that reached beyond the boundaries of mortal perception. The silence was not empty, it was full. Section 2. A whisper in the trees. 3 leagues south of Weathertop, where the old road bent toward the last bridge, stood a grove of birches that had witnessed the passing of the kings of Arnor. Their silver bark bore scars from ancient battles, and their roots delved deep into earth that held the bones of warriors long forgotten. It was here, in the hour before dawn, when the world lay caught between darkness and light, that the trees first began to speak of what they had seen. The voice came not as words, but as a trembling in the leaves, a susurrus that spoke of fear made manifest. Gandalf stood within the circle of the grove, his staff planted firm upon the moss-covered stones of what had once been a shrine to the Valar. The trees leaned inward as though seeking protection from his presence, their branches interlacing overhead like fingers clasped in prayer. "Long have you kept your watch," the wizard murmured, his voice carrying the authority of one who had walked in the light of the 2 trees. "What tale do you tell now that was not told before?" The answer came in the rustling of 10,000 leaves, in the creaking of bark that had grown thick with years beyond counting. Images formed in Gandalf's mind, not clear as crystal, but shadowed as memory often is when touched by fear. He saw riders cloaked in black passing beneath the branches in the deep of night, their mounts leaving no prints upon the earth. He witnessed lights that burned with cold flame in the ruins of ancient halls, and heard the echo of voices speaking in tongues that had been forbidden since the fall of Númenor. But it was the last vision that brought the Grey Pilgrim to full attention, his weathered hands tightening upon his staff until the runes blazed forth with sudden fire. He saw Weathertop itself, not as it stood now in ruin, but wreathed in shadow that moved with purpose and malice. Upon its broken crown gathered shapes that had no rightful place in the world of the living. 9 figures that bore the semblance of kings, but carried within them only darkness and the echo of their master's will. The trees fell silent, their tale told. Gandalf remained still for a long moment, weighing what he had learned against what he had feared. The Nazgûl had been abroad. This much he had suspected. But that they should come to Weathertop, to the ancient seat of the Dúnedain's power, spoke of purpose that went beyond mere wandering in search of their lost ring. They seek to claim what was never theirs, he said at last, and his words carried across the grove like a bell tolling in the distance. But the stones of Amon Sûl remember their true masters, and the fire that once burned there may yet kindle again. As the first light of dawn touched the eastern sky, Gandalf turned from the grove and set his face toward the north, where duty called and darkness waited. Behind him, the birches swayed in the morning breeze, their silver leaves whispering of hope born from ancient courage. Section 3. The Lone Rider. The road to Bree ran straight as an arrow's flight through the rolling countryside, cutting through meadows where the last flowers of autumn bloomed in defiance of the coming winter. It was a road well traveled in the days of peace, when merchants bore their goods from the Shire to the towns of men, and when news flowed freely between the scattered settlements of Eriador. Now it lay empty beneath the grey sky, its stone worn smooth by countless feet, but bearing no prints save those of the grey wizard's worn boots. Gandalf walked with the measured pace of one who knows the value of haste and the greater value of arriving at the proper time. His grey cloak billowed behind him in the autumn wind, and his staff rang against the stones with a rhythm that spoke of determination made manifest. Yet for all his purposeful stride, his eyes remained ever watchful, scanning the horizon for signs of movement, his ears attuned to sounds that ordinary folk would never hear. The sun climbed toward its zenith, casting short shadows from the hawthorn hedges that lined the road. It was then that Gandalf first glimpsed the lone rider approaching from the east, a figure mounted upon a horse of such darkness that it seemed to drink the very light from the air around it. Even at a distance, the wizard felt the chill that emanated from both horse and rider, a cold that spoke not of winter, but of the grave. Without breaking his stride, Gandalf shifted his grip upon his staff, feeling the power that lay coiled within the ancient wood respond to his touch. The rider drew nearer, and now the Grey Pilgrim could see the tattered remnants of what had once been royal robes, the crown that sat upon a head no longer capable of bearing its weight with honor. This was one of the 9, a Nazgûl abroad in daylight, something that should not be, yet was. The ringwraith halted its mount a dozen paces from where Gandalf stood in the center of the road. For a long moment, neither moved, each taking the measure of the other across a gulf that separated the living from the undead, the servant of light from the slave of darkness. When the Nazgûl spoke, its voice was like the whisper of wind through a charnel house, carrying with it the echo of its master's will. "Grey Wanderer," it hissed, "you walk where you are not welcome. The roads grow dark, and the safe places fail. Turn back while turn back you may." Gandalf planted his staff firmly upon the stones, and its light blazed forth like a star kindled in the growing darkness. "I am Gandalf the Grey," he declared, and his voice carried the authority of the Valar themselves. "I go where I will, and the roads of Middle-earth are not yours to command. Begone, creature of shadow, and trouble not the paths of the free peoples." The Nazgûl recoiled as though struck, its horse rearing in terror at the light that blazed from the wizard's staff. For a heartbeat, it seemed as though the creature would flee. Then its hand moved to the sword at its side, and the air grew thick with malice and the promise of violence. But before blade could clear scabbard, a sound arose that gave even the ringwraith pause. The clear notes of a horn blown somewhere in the distance, echoing across the hills with the voice of defiance itself. With a shriek that split the air like a blade, the Nazgûl wheeled its mount and rode eastward, vanishing into the gathering shadows as though it had never been. Gandalf remained standing in the road long after the sound of hoofbeats had faded, his staff still blazing with protective fire. The encounter had confirmed his darkest fears. The Nine were abroad, and their purpose was no mere wandering. They sought something or someone. Section 4. Dol Guldur in the distance. The fortress of Dol Guldur crouched upon its hill like a spider in its web, its black towers reaching toward the sky like accusing fingers. From the borders of the forest where Gandalf stood, wrapped in the shadows of the great trees, the stronghold seemed almost to pulse with a life that belonged to no wholesome thing. The very air around it shimmered with heat that rose not from any natural fire, but from the malice that had taken root within its walls and grown strong in darkness. It had been many years since the Grey Wizard had looked upon that cursed place, and he saw now that the shadow had grown deeper in his absence. Where once there had been merely ruin and the whisper of old evil, now there blazed forth a power that made the stones themselves cry out in anguish. New towers had risen from the rubble of the old, their walls black as night and smooth as glass, reflecting no light save the hellish glow that emanated from within. The forest around the hill had withered and died. The great trees that had once formed a green wall about the fortress, now standing as gaunt skeletons against the grey sky. Their bark had peeled away in long strips, and their branches reached toward heaven like the arms of supplicants pleading for mercy that would never come. Even the ground beneath them had turned to ash and cinder, as though some great fire had passed over the land and left nothing but desolation in its wake. From his hidden vantage point, Gandalf watched the comings and goings upon the hill with eyes that had seen the making of the world. Creatures moved about the walls, orcs and worse things, servants of the shadow that had claimed this place for its own. But it was not the lesser servants that drew his attention. It was the presence he felt pressing against the borders of his mind, a will that sought to penetrate his thoughts and lay bare the secrets he carried. The necromancer was indeed returned to Dol Guldur, and his power had grown beyond what Gandalf had feared. No longer was this merely a shadow seeking to hide in the ruins of a forgotten fortress. This was a force that threatened to overwhelm all the defenses of the Free Peoples, a darkness that would not be content until it had claimed dominion over all of Middle-earth. As if sensing his presence despite all his craft and caution, the malevolent will turned its attention toward the forest where the wizard stood concealed. Gandalf felt the touch of that alien mind like ice upon his heart, probing, seeking, demanding entrance to thoughts that were his alone to command. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the two powers contended in silence, the servant of light holding fast against the assault of darkness. Then, with an effort that left him trembling, Gandalf broke free from that terrible contact and withdrew deeper into the shadows of the forest. The necromancer's laughter followed him, a sound that spoke of confidence born from power too long unchallenged. The Grey Wizard had learned what he came to discover, but the knowledge brought no comfort. The shadow in the east was ready to reveal itself, and the time of hiding was nearly at an end. Behind him, as he melted into the deeper woods, the towers of Dol Guldur blazed with renewed fire, and the very stones seemed to sing with malicious joy. The master had returned to his fortress, and his servants would soon be unleashed upon a world unprepared for the darkness that was to come. Section 5. Into the Black. The descent into the roots of Dol Guldur was like passing through the gates of death itself. Gandalf moved with careful steps down passages that had been carved from the living rock of the hill, their walls black with the soot of fires that burned without fuel and gave forth no warmth. The air was thick with the stench of corruption, and every breath was a struggle against the malice that had soaked into the very stones. Here in the depths beneath the fortress, far from the light of sun and star, the necromancer had built his true stronghold. These were not the ruins of some ancient keep reclaimed and fortified anew. These were chambers purpose-built for dark sorcery, their architecture following patterns that hurt the eye to follow and whispered of geometries that belonged to realms beyond the circles of the world. The Grey Wizard's staff blazed with white fire as he pressed deeper into the labyrinth, its light revealing things that were better left unseen. Symbols had been carved into the walls with tools that left no marks save those of pain, and the floor was stained with substances that had once been precious beyond measure, but were now corrupted beyond redemption. Each step forward required an effort of will, for the very air seemed to press against him with the weight of accumulated malice. From the shadows came whispers in languages that predated the awakening of men, voices that spoke of bargains struck in darkness and prices paid in blood and soul. Gandalf pressed onward, his weathered face set in lines of grim determination. He had come too far to turn back now, and the need for knowledge outweighed the danger to his own spirit. At the heart of the labyrinth stood a door wrought from metal that seemed to drink the light of his staff and give nothing back. Upon its surface were inscribed words in the black speech of Mordor, characters that burned like brands upon the wizard's sight. This was the entrance to the necromancer's inner sanctum, the chamber where the darkest of his works were wrought. Gandalf raised his staff and spoke a word of opening, a word that had been taught to him in the halls of Manwë himself. The door swung inward without sound, revealing a darkness so complete that even his magical light seemed dim and feeble within its bounds. The air that flowed from the chamber beyond carried with it the scent of the grave and the echo of screams that had been silenced long ago. As he stepped across the threshold, Gandalf felt the weight of watching eyes upon him. Though he could see nothing in the impenetrable darkness, somewhere in the shadows, something stirred. Not the movement of a physical form, but the shifting of attention that spoke of a mind vast and terrible, turning its regard upon him. The necromancer knew he was here, had known from the moment he set foot upon the hill. "Welcome, Grey Wanderer," came a voice from the darkness, rich and smooth as honey poured over broken glass. "I have been expecting you for some time. Come, let us speak of matters that concern us both, the fate of rings and the folly of those who would keep them from their rightful master." The trap was sprung, and Gandalf stood within the heart of darkness itself, his staff the only light in a realm where hope went to die. Yet even here, in this place of ultimate shadow, the fire of his spirit burned undimmed, a star that would not be quenched, though all the powers of darkness stood arrayed against it. Section 6. The Captive King. In the deepest dungeon of Dol Guldur, where the stones wept tears of blood and the air hung thick with despair, there sat a figure that had once commanded the respect of kingdoms. King Thrain, son of Thror, last king under the mountain in exile, raised his head as the light of Gandalf's staff pierced the darkness of his cell. His hair, once golden as the treasure of Erebor, had turned white as snow, and his eyes held depths of madness born from years of torment at the hands of the necromancer. "Who walks in light in this place of shadow?" the Dwarf King whispered, his voice cracked and broken from screaming that had long since given way to silence. "Have you come to add your torment to mine, servant of the dark? I have no more secrets to give. The treasures of my people are scattered to the wind, and their king is broken beyond repair." Gandalf knelt beside the wretched figure, his heart heavy with grief at what he saw. This had been a king among his people, a leader whose courage had been legend among the dwarves. Now he was reduced to little more than a shadow of his former self, his body bearing the marks of tortures that spoke of malice refined to its purest essence. "I am Gandalf the Grey," the wizard said softly, his voice carrying all the compassion that remained in a world grown dark. "I am no servant of shadow, but a friend to all free peoples. Tell me, Thrain, son of Thror, how came you to this place of torment?" At the mention of his name and lineage, something flickered in the dwarf's eyes, a spark of the pride that had once made him a king. "Gandalf," he breathed, and in that word was all the hope that remained to him. "Then, you are real, and not another vision sent to mock my suffering. I remember you from the halls of my father, in the days when the mountain burned with dragon fire and our people walked the roads of exile." With trembling hands, Thrain reached into the tattered remains of his robe and withdrew something that gleamed dull gold in the light of the wizard's staff. It was a key and a map. Both worked with the cunning of the dwarfsmiths, their surfaces covered with runes that spoke of secret ways and hidden doors. "Take these," the fallen king said, pressing the precious objects into Gandalf's hands with strength born of desperation. "They are the key and map to the secret entrance of Erebor, known only to my line. My son Thorin believes them lost, but I kept them close even in this place of torment. The necromancer has sought to wrest them from me these many years, for he knows their worth. Gandalf felt the weight of the objects in his hands, understanding at once their significance. With these, the mountain might be reclaimed, the treasure of the dwarves restored to their rightful hands. But more than that, the map spoke of opportunities that the Grey Wizard had only begun to perceive, chances to set in motion events that might counter the growing shadow in the east. "The dragon still sleeps," Thrain continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "But his slumber grows lighter, and the necromancer whispers to him in dreams of treasure stolen and glory dimmed. Soon Smaug will wake in wrath, and his fire will serve the shadow's purpose. Unless the mountain is reclaimed first," Gandalf finished, understanding flooding through him like light breaking through clouds. "Unless the dragon is defeated by other means, and his horde turned to the service of the free peoples rather than the forces of darkness." Thrain nodded, and for a moment the madness cleared from his eyes entirely, revealing the king he had once been. "My line has hope still, Grey Wizard. My son Thorin bears the pride of our people, and his nephews have courage that burns bright as forge fire. With your wisdom to guide them and these tokens to show them the way, they might yet accomplish what armies could not." The sound of footsteps echoed from the passages beyond, and both king and wizard knew their time was short. Gandalf rose, the key and map safe within his robes, his mind already turning to the plans that would need to be made. Section 7. The Necromancer's Voice. The laughter that filled the chamber was like the sound of glaciers breaking in the far north, beautiful and terrible in its awful majesty. From the darkness beyond the reach of Gandalf's light stepped a figure robed in shadow that seemed to move with a life of its own. The necromancer revealed himself at last, and the Grey Wizard felt the full weight of the malice that had been growing in strength within these walls. "Did you think to steal from me unnoticed, Mithrandir?" The voice carried echoes of the music that had shaped the world, but corrupted now and turned to purposes of domination and despair. "The map and key were bait, nothing more. I could have taken them from the broken king at any time, but I chose to wait, to see who would come seeking what should not be found." Gandalf stood firm against the tide of malevolence that pressed against him from all sides, his staff blazing with renewed fire. Now he could see the true face of his enemy, and the sight filled him with a dread that reached to the very depths of his being. This was no mere sorcerer drunk on power stolen from ancient tombs. This was Sauron himself. The Dark Lord returned to physical form and growing strong in preparation for wars yet to come. "Your disguise fools no one who has looked upon your true face, Lord of Mordor," Gandalf said, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at his heart. "I know you for what you are, and I name you before all powers of Middle-earth, Sauron the Deceiver, Sauron the Necromancer, enemy of all that is good and fair in this world." The Dark Lord's laughter grew louder until it seemed the very stones of the fortress would crack beneath its weight. "Names have power, Grey Fool, but not the power you imagine. I am beyond such bindings now, grown mighty in exile, and ready to reclaim what was always mine by right. The free people scatter like leaves before the storm, and their champions grow few and weak." Shadows began to gather around Sauron's form, coalescing into shapes that spoke of nightmares made manifest. The air grew thick with malice, and Gandalf felt the strength being drawn from his limbs, as though the very act of standing in this place was poison to all that he was. You see the dragon sickness that gnaws at the hearts of the dwarf lords, Sauron continued, his voice now a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. You know the weakness that runs in the blood of kings. Even now, the wise grow proud and cautious, content to watch from their high places while darkness spreads like plague across the world. Who will stand when I reveal myself in all my power? Who will dare to oppose the Lord of the earth? Despite the crushing weight of despair that pressed upon him, Gandalf found strength in memories that stretched back to the very beginning of days. He had stood in the light of the two trees, had heard the music that brought forth stars and worlds. Against such memories, even the malice of the Dark Lord seemed small and petty. There is more strength in the world than you know, the Grey Wizard declared, raising his staff until its light blazed forth like a star newborn. In the courage of the small and simple, in the love that binds heart to heart across all divisions of race and realm. You have forgotten such things in your pride, and that forgetting will be your downfall. The light from Gandalf's staff swept across the chamber like a cleansing fire, and for a moment the shadows were driven back. Sauron recoiled, his form wavering as though struck by physical force. In that instant of uncertainty, the Grey Wizard turned and fled, carrying with him the knowledge he had come to gain and the precious tokens that might yet turn the tide of events to come. Behind him, the Dark Lord's roar of rage shook the very foundations of Dol Guldur, but Gandalf was already gone, racing through passages that led toward light and hope, and the chance to set in motion the events that would decide the fate of Middle-earth. Section 8. Fire in the darkness. The pursuit came swift as storm winds, but Gandalf was swifter still. Through the twisting corridors of Dol Guldur he ran, his staff blazing before him like a torch held against the night. Behind him came the servants of the shadow, orcs and worse things, creatures that had been twisted from their original forms into instruments of malice and hate. Their howls echoed through the fortress like the voices of the damned, promising torments that would make Thrain's suffering seem as gentle as a summer rain. Up he climbed through levels of the fortress that rose like tears of damnation, each more terrible than the last. Here were chambers where unspeakable experiments had been conducted upon living flesh, transforming captives into abominations that served their master's will. There were forges where weapons were wrought not from iron and steel, but from crystallized malice and the essence of despair itself. At every turn, new horrors blocked his path. Great spiders dropped from webs spun in the darkness overhead, their eyes glowing with hunger for living flesh. Wraiths materialized from the shadows, their touch bringing cold that could freeze the blood in a man's veins. But against all these servants of darkness, the light of Gandalf's staff burned bright and true, driving them back with fire that spoke of powers beyond their comprehension. The Grey Wizard reached the great hall of the fortress just as the stones beneath his feet began to crack and split. The very foundations of Dol Guldur were coming apart, shaken by the rage of its master. Through the vast chamber he ran, past pillars carved with obscene symbols and tapestries woven from nightmares. The air itself seemed to burn with malice, and every breath was like swallowing liquid fire. At the great doors that led to the outer walls, Gandalf turned and raised his staff one final time. Words of power spilled from his lips, words in the tongue of the Valar themselves, carrying with them the authority of the West and the promise of light that would never be extinguished. The hall behind him erupted in flame, not the corrupt fire of Sauron's making, but clean flame that burned away corruption and left only truth in its wake. The doors burst open before him, and suddenly he was free beneath the grey sky. But his escape was not yet complete, for from the highest tower of the fortress came a shriek that split the air like a blade. A shape detached itself from the dark stone. One of the Nazgûl, mounted upon its fell beast, diving towards him with talons outstretched and eyes blazing with the cold fire of the grave. Gandalf spoke a word that had not been heard in Middle-earth since the Elder Days, and the sky above him blazed with light as though the stars themselves had descended to his aid. The Nazgûl's mount recoiled from that radiance, its wings beating frantically as it struggled to escape the searing illumination. Horse and rider tumbled from the sky, crashing into the twisted trees that surrounded the fortress with a sound like thunder. For a moment, all was still. Then from the ruins of Dol Guldur came a voice that carried across leagues, a voice filled with such malice that birds fell dead from the sky and flowers withered in fields far distant. Sauron's rage knew no bounds, for his secret had been discovered and his plans laid bare before the eyes of his enemies. But Gandalf was already leagues away, racing across the broken lands toward the safety of the forest and the hope of civilization beyond. In his robes, the key and map of Erebor seemed to burn with their own inner fire, as though they too knew the importance of the role they would play in the days to come. Behind him, the towers of Dol Guldur blazed with renewed malice, and the Dark Lord began to gather his strength for the wars that would determine the fate of all free peoples. The time of hiding was nearly at an end, and soon the world would learn what horrors had been brewing in the darkness of the southern forest. Section 9. Return to the Wise. The hidden valley of Rivendell lay wrapped in the golden light of autumn, its halls echoing with the song of waters that had flowed since the Elder Days. Here, in the house of Elrond, half-elven, the last remnant of Gil-galad's court, wisdom was preserved that stretched back to the very foundations of the world. It was to this sanctuary that Gandalf came when his long road from the darkness of Dol Guldur finally ended, his grey cloak travel-stained and his staff dim with exhaustion. Lord Elrond received him in the Hall of Fire, where the hearth burned with flames that cast no shadow and gave forth warmth that touched the spirit as well as the flesh. The Master of Rivendell was ancient beyond the reckoning of mortal years, his face bearing the wisdom of ages and the sorrow of one who had seen too much of the world's pain. With him stood Saruman the White, greatest of the Astari, his robes pristine and his bearing proud as befitted the head of the White Council. "Dark tidings bring you to our halls, Mithrandir," Elrond said, his voice carrying the music of waters over stone. "The very air about you speaks of shadow encountered and dangers faced. What have you learned in the southern lands that weighs so heavily upon your spirit?" Gandalf sank into a chair before the fire, feeling the weight of years and journeys in his bones. For a long moment, he was silent, gathering his thoughts and choosing his words with care. What he had to say would shake the foundations of their careful plans and force them to confront truths they had hoped to avoid. "The necromancer of Dol Guldur has revealed himself at last," he said finally, his voice heavy with the burden of knowledge. "It is as we feared in our darkest moments. Sauron has returned to Middle-earth, and his power grows with each passing season. No longer does he hide behind the pretense of mere sorcery. He gathers his strength openly, preparing for war." Saruman's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or might have been fear. "You speak of matters beyond your authority, Grey Wanderer," he said, his voice sharp as winter wind. "The White Council has not yet determined the truth of these claims. To name the enemy so boldly is to invite the very attention we seek to avoid." "The attention is already upon us," Gandalf replied, rising from his chair with sudden fire blazing in his eyes. "I have stood in his presence, heard his voice, felt the weight of his malice. This is no vague threat whispered in rumors and shadow. Sauron lives, Sauron plans, and Sauron prepares to reclaim dominion over all the lands between the sea and the mountains of shadow." Elrond raised a hand, and peace settled over the hall like a gentle rain. "If what you say is true, Gandalf the Grey, then our time of watching and waiting draws to a close. The defenses of the free peoples must be strengthened, and the scattered realms must be brought together in alliance against the coming storm. Yet what can be done?" Saruman demanded, his proud face creased with lines of worry. "The kingdoms of men grow weak and divided. The dwarves delve deep and care nothing for the troubles of the world above. Even the elves prepare for the journey west, abandoning Middle-earth to whatever fate awaits it." It was then that Gandalf drew forth the key and map he had wrested from the dungeons of Dol Guldur, laying them upon the table where their gold gleamed in the firelight. "All is not yet lost," he said, and his voice carried hope like a bell ringing across dark waters. "There are powers in the world that the enemy has not accounted for, deeds that may yet be done to confound his designs. The key to Erebor and the map of its secret ways. With these, the lonely mountain might be reclaimed and the dragon's horde turned to the service of those who would stand against the darkness." Elrond leaned forward, his eyes studying the precious objects with the wisdom of ages. "Bold words, Mithrandir. But the dragon Smaug is not lightly faced. What force could stand against such a creature, and what hero would dare to beard the worm in his den?" A smile touched the corners of Gandalf's mouth, the first such expression to cross his features since his escape from Dol Guldur. "Heroes are not always found where we expect them, my lord. Sometimes they come from the most unlikely places, bearing hearts greater than their stature and courage that shames the mighty. I have in mind a certain hobbit and a company of dwarves with claim to the mountain's throne." Section 10. Stirring the North. The road to the Blue Mountains wound through valleys where the dwarves had made their homes in exile, their halls carved into living rock, and their forges burning bright against the gathering darkness of the world. Here, in the shadow of the ancient peaks, the remnants of Durin's folk maintained their crafts and preserved their memories of the glory that had been Erebor. It was to this place that Gandalf came, bearing with him the tokens that would set in motion events beyond all prediction. Thorin Oakenshield, rightful king under the mountain, received the Grey Wizard in his modest hall, a far cry from the golden chambers his forefathers had known. The Dwarf Lord bore himself with the dignity of his lineage, but Gandalf could see the weight of exile that pressed upon his shoulders, the bitter knowledge that his birthright lay beyond reach beneath the jealous coils of the dragon. "Welcome, Gandalf Greyhame," Thorin said, offering the traditional bread and salt of hospitality. "Word has come to us of dark stirrings in the southern lands, and your counsel is always valued among our people. What brings you to our halls in these troubled times?" Without words, Gandalf placed the key and map upon the table between them, watching as Thorin's eyes widened with recognition and wonder. The Dwarf Lord reached out with trembling hands, touching the precious objects as though they might vanish at his touch. "The key of my father," he whispered, and his voice carried all the grief and hope of his people. "We thought it lost when the dragon came, buried beneath the flames with all our other treasures. How comes it to your hands, Grey Wizard? What tale do these tokens tell?" "A tale of suffering and endurance," Gandalf replied gently, "and of hope preserved even in the darkest places. Your father lives still, Thorin, son of Thrain, though captive in a place where shadows gather. These tokens he gave to me with his own hands, charging me to bring them to you with word of the secret door they reveal." The firelight played across Thorin's face as he studied the map, tracing with his finger the runes that marked the hidden entrance to his ancestral home. "The secret door," he breathed, "known only to my line and thought sealed forever when Smaug claimed the mountain. But even if the way lies open, what hope have we against such a foe? The dragon's fire burned away armies in the days of our grandfather's pride. Dragons are not immortal," Gandalf said, his voice carrying the weight of ancient knowledge. "They may be slain by blade or bow if the hand that wields them is guided by courage and aided by fortune. And Smaug has grown fat and lazy in his years of undisturbed slumber. He is still terrible, but perhaps not so terrible as legend makes him." Thorin rose from his chair and began to pace, his mind working through possibilities and dangers. "If what you say is true, then perhaps, but I would need companions for such a quest. Warriors of proven worth, skilled in the arts of stealth and war. My nephews, Fili and Kili, surely, and perhaps others of our kindred who remember the mountain's glory." "A company of 13 would be fitting," Gandalf agreed, for such was the number of the companions of Eru in the old tales. "But you will need more than strength of arm and sharpness of blade. You will need one who can move unseen and unheard, who can slip past the dragon's watching eye and find the treasures that lie buried in his hoard." "A burglar?" Thorin's eyes lit with understanding. "But where are we to find such a one, who would risk the dragon's wrath for the promise of gold and glory?" Gandalf's smile was mysterious as starlight. "I know of one who might serve your need, though he knows it not himself. A certain hobbit of the Shire, whose courage sleeps beneath comfort, but runs as deep as the roots of mountains. With your permission, I will sound him out, and if he proves willing, he shall have the 14th share of whatever treasure we recover." Thus began the planning that would reshape the map of Middle-earth, as the Grey Wizard and the King in exile laid the foundations for a quest that would wake echoes in every corner of the world. Behind them, the wheels of fate began to turn, and in distant places, powers both dark and light stirred in response to choices yet unmade. Section 11. A Hobbit Remembered. The Shire lay green and peaceful beneath the autumn sun, its fields heavy with the harvest and its lanes bustling with the gentle business of a folk who knew little of the troubles that plagued the wider world. Here, in this blessed corner of Middle-earth, the hobbits went about their daily lives in perfect contentment, tending their gardens and enjoying their meals with the simple pleasure that comes from honest work and peaceful days. Bag End stood upon its hill like a jewel set in emerald, its round door painted green as spring leaves and its windows gleaming in the golden light. Smoke rose from the chimney, carrying with it the scent of an excellent dinner and the promise of comfort for any who might call upon the master of the house. It was here that Gandalf came at last, his staff tapping upon the well-kept path that led to the most famous door in Hobbiton. Bilbo Baggins opened to his knock with the politeness that befitted a respectable hobbit, though his eyes showed the faint wariness that comes from dealing with big folk and their peculiar ways. He was a hobbit in his prime, neither young nor old, with the comfortable roundness that spoke of good living and the bright eyes that hinted at intelligence often overlooked by those who judged by size alone. "Good morning," said Bilbo, though whether he meant that Gandalf should have a good morning, or that it was a good morning whether Gandalf wanted it or not, or that he felt good about the morning, was not entirely clear. "What do you mean?" asked Gandalf, leaning on his staff and regarding the hobbit with amusement. "Do you wish me a good morning, or mean that it is a good morning whether I want it or not, or that you feel good this morning, or that it is a morning to be good on?" The conversation that followed was as gentle as rain and as meaningful as the turning of seasons, for Gandalf remembered well the young hobbit who had once sat upon a garden wall and spoken of adventures that lay beyond the borders of the Shire. That youth had grown into a prosperous gentleman, content with his books and his pantry, his maps and his morning tea. Yet beneath the comfortable exterior, the grey wizard sensed the ember of something that had never quite been extinguished. "I am looking for someone to share in an adventure that I am arranging," Gandalf said at length, watching the play of expressions across Bilbo's face. "And it's very difficult to find anyone these days. Adventures are not all pony rides in May sunshine, you know. Nasty, disturbing, uncomfortable things that make you late for dinner." The reaction was immediate and predictable. Bilbo backed away from his door as though adventure were a contagious disease that might be caught by proximity. "We don't want any adventures here, thank you. You might try over the hill or across the water. Good morning." But as the door swung shut, Gandalf placed his staff against it and spoke a single word that carried with it the weight of destiny. "To think that I should have lived to be good-morninged by Belladonna Took's son, as if I was selling buttons at the door." The door opened again, more slowly this time, and Bilbo's face appeared in the gap with an expression of dawning recognition. Gandalf, not the wandering wizard who used to tell such wonderful tales at parties, who made such particularly excellent fireworks. Old Took used to have them on Midsummer's Eve. Splendid. They used to go up like great lilies and snapdragons and laburnums of fire and hang in the twilight all evening. Memory opened like a flower, and with it came the echo of a youth who had dreamed of maps and dragons, of treasure and glory in distant lands. The Took side of Bilbo's nature stirred for the first time in years, whispering of paths not taken and doors not opened. In that moment, Gandalf saw what he had hoped to find, not a burglar ready-made, but the raw material from which heroes might be crafted. The seed was planted, though it would take time to grow. But seeds planted by wizards have a way of sprouting in the most unlikely soil. And Gandalf knew that when the time came for choosing, Bilbo Baggins would surprise himself with the depths of courage he carried beneath his respectable waistcoat. Section 12. The Sardi plan set in motion. The unexpected party at Bag End began with a single dwarf and grew like a river in flood, until 13 warriors sat around Bilbo's table and filled his respectable hobbit hole with the sound of deep voices and the clink of weapons. Thorin Oakenshield had come as agreed, bringing with him his nephews and 10 others of his kindred, each chosen for skills that would serve their purpose in the trials ahead. Bilbo fluttered about his invaded home like a bird whose nest has been claimed by eagles, offering tea and seed cake while trying to process the magnitude of what was being proposed. The map lay spread upon his table, its secret runes glowing faintly in the firelight, while the key gleamed beside it like a promise of wonders beyond imagination. Far over the misty mountains cold, Thorin sang, his voice deep and resonant with the grief of his people. To dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day, to seek the pale enchanted gold. The song filled the parlor with visions of ancient glory and present sorrow, of treasure halls beneath the mountain, and the worm that guarded them with jealous fire. As the night wore on and the details of their planned journey became clear, Bilbo found himself caught between terror and fascination. The thought of leaving his comfortable home and venturing into the wild lands where dragons dwelt filled him with horror. Yet something deeper stirred within him, the blood of the Tooks that had always run strong in his veins, whispering of adventures that awaited beyond the borders of respectability. I should like to know about risks, out-of-pocket expenses, time required, and remuneration, and so forth, he said at last, trying to approach the matter with the practical mind of a Baggins, even as his Tookish heart raced with excitement. Glóin produced a contract written in the formal language of dwarf law, its clauses covering everything from burial expenses to the division of treasure. As Bilbo read the carefully crafted words, the reality of what was being asked of him became clear. This was no mere journey to a nearby market town, but an expedition into the very heart of danger, where the chances of returning with both life and sanity intact were far from certain. "Think it over, Master Baggins," Thorin said, his voice carrying the weight of kingly authority despite his exile. "We leave at dawn, whether you come with us or not, but I confess that a 14th member would be most welcome, particularly one skilled in the arts of stealth and burglary." The night passed in restless sleep for all concerned, dreams filled with fire and gold and the sound of wings in darkness. When dawn came grey and cold, 13 dwarves stood ready for the road, their packs shouldered and their weapons bright with purpose. They waited in the lane outside Bag End as the sun climbed toward the horizon, giving the hobbit one last chance to choose between comfort and glory. At the final moment, just as Thorin was preparing to lead his company away without their hoped-for burglar, Bilbo came running down the path with the contract clutched in one hand and a hastily packed bag in the other. "I'm going on an adventure," he called, surprising himself with the words even as he spoke them. Thus began the quest that would shake the foundations of the North and send ripples throughout Middle-earth. As the company rode away from Hobbiton into the rising sun, Gandalf smiled with satisfaction. The pieces of his plan were falling into place, and though the road ahead was dark with peril, he had chosen his instruments well. Behind them, the Shire settled back into its accustomed peace, unaware that one of its sons had just stepped onto a path that would lead to deeds of legend and tales that would be told for generations yet to come. Section 13. The Fire Awakens. Deep beneath the lonely mountain, in chambers carved from living rock and filled with the accumulated wealth of ages, something stirred that had slept for 60 years, undisturbed. Smaug the mighty, Smaug the impenetrable, Smaug the unassailable, felt the first whisper of unease penetrate the golden dreams that had filled his long slumber. The treasure that lay heaped about him like a metallic sea, cups and coins and coronets, swords and shields and silver plate, seemed to shift and murmur in ways that spoke of disturbance in the natural order. The great worm's eyes opened like furnaces kindled in the darkness, their fire casting dancing shadows upon the walls of his lair. Each orb was larger than a warrior's shield, filled with malice refined over centuries of greed and solitude. His nostrils flared as he tested the air, seeking the scent of whatever had dared to penetrate the borders of his domain. Something was wrong. Something had changed in the world beyond his mountain fastness. For decades beyond counting, Smaug had lain in perfect contentment upon his bed of gold, feeling the weight of treasure beneath his armored belly and knowing that all the wealth of Erebor was his to command. The dwarves who had once called this place home were scattered to the winds, their king slain and their people reduced to wandering exiles. The men of Dale had been burned from their homes, their city reduced to ash and memory. No force in Middle-earth dared challenge the dragon's dominion over the mountain and all its treasures. Yet now, in the deep places of his serpentine mind, Smaug felt the touch of something that should not be. It was subtle as spider silk, this sensation that something moved against him in the darkness of the world. Powers stirred that he had thought long quiescent, and voices whispered in languages he remembered from the elder days when the world was young and dragons were not yet the terror they would become. Rising from his bed of gold with a sound like landslide, Smaug stretched his massive form and felt the mountain tremble beneath his weight. His scales, each one forged in the fires of his own malice, and harder than the finest dwarf mail, caught the light of his burning eyes and threw it back in shimmers of red and gold. The beat of his heart was like drums of war, and his breath carried with it the promise of flames that could melt stone and reduce armies to ash. Through the halls of Erebor he slithered, his great bulk flowing like molten metal through passages that had once echoed with the songs of dwarfsmiths at their work. The throne room of the Mountain Kings lay empty and cold, its golden floor cracked beneath the weight of his coils. The great forge where weapons of legendary power had been wrought stood silent and dark, its fires long since cooled to nothing. But it was not in the halls of the dead that Smaug would find what disturbed his rest. The unease that gnawed at him came from farther afield, from the movements of beings so small they barely registered upon his awareness, yet somehow significant beyond their size. Men and dwarves and other creatures were stirring in the wider world, making choices and taking actions that would have consequences reaching even to his impregnable lair in the halls of Dol Guldur. his ancient ally felt the dragon's awakening, like a tremor in the web of his plans. Sauron smiled with satisfaction that had no warmth in it, knowing that the time of waiting was nearly at an end. Soon the fire drake would be needed for purposes greater than mere treasure guarding, and the terror of the North would serve the will of the Lord of Mordor as he had served in the wars of old. The game was afoot, and all the pieces were beginning to move toward the confrontation that would determine the fate of Middle-earth. Section 14. A blade, not yet drawn. In the fortress of Isengard, where the river Isen wound its way through the ring of Orthanc, Saruman the White stood upon the pinnacle of his tower and gazed out over lands that stretched away toward every horizon. The evening sun painted the plain in shades of gold and crimson, but the beauty of the sight brought no pleasure to the wizard's heart. His mind was occupied with weightier matters than the mere play of light upon grass and stone. From his vantage point, high above the surrounding countryside, Saruman could see farther than any mortal eye might reach. His vision, enhanced by arts learned in the halls of the Valar themselves, perceived the movements of armies still hidden from common sight. In the south, the forces of Mordor stirred like ants in a disturbed hill, preparing for wars that would reshape the very map of Middle-earth. Orcs bred in the darkness beneath the mountains. Trolls were driven forth from their caves with whips of flame, and engines of war took shape in forges that burned with unholy fire. Yet it was not only in Mordor that darkness gathered. From his own ring wall came the sound of hammers on anvils as his Uruk-hai smiths labored to create weapons of war. The White Wizard had chosen his path, though he told himself it was wisdom rather than treachery that guided his steps. The old order was failing, and only by aligning himself with the rising power could he hope to preserve something of the light in the coming darkness. The crystal globe that stood before him upon its pedestal pulsed with inner fire, its depths revealing visions that no other seeing stone could match. Through this palantir, Saruman beheld the movements of his distant master, felt the pressure of that terrible will upon his own thoughts. Sauron's voice whispered across the leagues that separated them, promising dominion and power to those who serve faithfully, threatening destruction to any who stood in opposition. The Grey Fool meddles where he should not, came the voice, like honey poured over broken glass. His plans will serve our purpose well, though he knows it not. When the dragon falls and the mountain is reclaimed, the northern lands will be ripe for conquest. The kingdom under the mountain will become a stronghold of darkness, and its treasures will fuel our armies. Saruman bowed his head in acknowledgement, though his heart burned with resentment at being called servant by one who had once been his equal. It shall be as you command, my lord. My spies watch the Grey Wanderer's every move, and when the time comes to strike, our forces will be ready. The conversation continued deep into the night, covering strategies and contingencies, the movement of pieces upon a board that encompassed all of Middle-earth. When at last the palantir grew dark and silent, Saruman remained standing upon his tower, wrestling with thoughts that gave him no peace. Below him, in the depths of Isengard, the Uruk-hai went about their preparations with mechanical efficiency. These were not the crude orcs that served lesser masters, but creatures bred for war and shaped by arts, both ancient and terrible. Soon they would march forth to claim their place in the battles to come, and the white hand of Saruman would be raised in open war against those he had once called friends. The wind that blew across the plain carried with it the scent of smoke and fire, of steel being forged and armies being born. In distant halls, other powers felt the changing tide and made their own preparations. The elves drew closer to their havens, preparing for the long journey across the sea. The rangers of the north tightened their watch upon the borders of the Shire, knowing that storm clouds gathered beyond their sight. But it was in the simple courage of those who knew nothing of the great game that hope would ultimately lie. A hobbit walking the paths of adventure for the first time, dwarves reclaiming their ancient home, men rising to defend their lands against the tide of darkness. These were the threads from which victory might yet be woven if the Valar smiled and fortune proved kind. Section 15. The kingdom reclaimed the halls of Erebor rang once more with the voices of dwarves, though they echoed now with notes of triumph mixed with mourning. The dragon was dead, slain by the black arrow of Bard the bowman, his great carcass lying broken upon the ruins of Esgaroth, where it had fallen in the hour of his defeat. The treasures of the mountain kings lay open to the light of day for the first time in generations, their golden gleam no longer guarded by jealous fire, but free to serve the needs of the living. Thorin Oakenshield sat upon the throne of his fathers, the Arkenstone blazing upon his breast like a star reborn. Around him stood the survivors of the company that had dared the dragon's wrath, fewer now than when they had set out from the Shire, for the road to glory is always paved with sacrifice. Fili and Kili would ride no more to war, their young lives given in defense of the mountain they had helped to reclaim. Their loss was a wound that would never fully heal, a reminder that even victory comes with a price that makes the wise weep. Yet for all the grief that shadowed their triumph, the return of the king under the mountain marked a turning point in the affairs of the north. Already, word had spread across the lands of men and dwarves that Erebor was free, that the ancient kingdom had been restored and his treasures made available once more to those who would trade in friendship. Merchants prepared their caravans for journeys they had only dreamed of, and craftsmen sharpened their tools in anticipation of commissions that would test their skills to the utmost. Bilbo Baggins stood in the great hall and marveled at the transformation that had overtaken the place. Where once there had been only dust and dragon stench, now there was light and life and the sound of honest labor. Dwarves went about the business of restoration with the methodical efficiency of their race, clearing passages that had been blocked for decades and setting their forges to blazing once more. The hobbit's share of the treasure lay packed in a modest chest, more wealth than any son of the Shire had ever possessed, yet small beside the vast hoard that filled the mountain's vaults. For Bilbo had discovered that adventure changes more than one's circumstances. It changes the very nature of one's desires. The gold and jewels that had once seemed so important now felt heavy with the weight of lives lost to win them. "I think I prefer to go back," he said to Gandalf, who stood beside him watching the bustle of reclamation. "I want to see my own fireside again, and my garden, and perhaps write a book about all this. The dwarves can keep their gold. I have memories now that are worth more than all the treasure in the mountain." The Grey Wizard smiled. understanding that this too was part of the pattern he had set in motion. Heroes are forged in fire, but they are refined in the choices they make when the fire has cooled. Bilbo's decision to return home with only a small portion of his rightful share showed the wisdom that comes from seeing clearly what truly matters in life. But even as they celebrated their victory, shadows gathered on the horizon. Armies moved in the darkness, drawn by the scent of wealth newly won and the promise of easy conquest. The Battle of Five Armies was yet to come, where the fate of the North would be decided in blood and fire upon the slopes of the Lonely Mountain. In the depths of Dol Guldur, Sauron felt the death of the dragon like a physical blow. One of his greatest servants was gone, destroyed by the very quest he had hoped would serve his purposes. Yet all was not lost. Indeed, the fall of Smaug opened new possibilities that a mind as subtle as his could turn to advantage. The North would be weakened by the battles to come, and when the time was right, his armies would sweep down upon the scattered kingdoms like a tide of fire and death. The game continued, and though one piece had been removed from the board, the final outcome was far from certain. Section 16. Hope in Ashes. The green grass grew thick over the battlefield where the five armies had met in mortal combat, and flowers bloomed where blood had once stained the earth red. Spring had come to the Lonely Mountain, bringing with it the promise of renewal and the hope that grows eternal in the hearts of those who survive the darkest hours. Yet for all the beauty of the season, there were memories carved into stone and soil that would endure long after the last survivor had passed into legend. Gandalf stood upon the slopes of Erebor and watched the sun set behind the distant peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The grey wizard looked older than when this tale began, worn by journeys and battles and the weight of knowledge that pressed upon his shoulders. The Palantir of Orthanc had revealed its secrets at last, showing him visions of the darkness that yet remained to be faced, the trials that would test every free people before the end. Below him in the valley, the kingdom of Dale was rising anew from the ashes of the old. Bard the bowman, now crowned as king, labored alongside his people to rebuild what the dragon's fire had destroyed. The sound of hammers on stone and the voices of children at play spoke of life returning to places that had known only desolation for far too long. Yet even in this renewal, the wise could see the shadows that lay ahead. "The ring has awakened," Gandalf murmured to himself, feeling the truth of those words like ice in his heart. Sauron knows that his precious is no longer sleeping in the depths of the river. Soon he will begin to seek it in earnest, and all the powers of Middle-earth will be drawn into the searching. The thought of Bilbo Baggins, safe now in his hobbit hole with his kettle and his books, brought both comfort and concern to the wizard's mind. The little burglar had served his purpose admirably, though he knew it not. The dragon was dead, the kingdom restored, and the North was stronger now than it had been in living memory. Yet the greatest test was yet to come, and it would fall upon the shoulders of one who had never asked for such a burden. In the halls of Erebor, Thorin's young cousin Dain now ruled with wisdom born of hard experience. The Iron Hills had sent their strength to aid in the battle, and now dwarves and men worked together to forge alliances that would serve them well in the darkness ahead. The treasure of the mountain would buy them swords and shields, provisions and allies, but it could not purchase the courage that would be needed when the final confrontation came. Far to the south, in the Tower of Ecthelion, the stewards of Gondor felt the stirring of ancient fears. The beacons had not been lit in living memory, but already the guards who tended them looked often toward the eastern borders, where smoke rose from valleys that should have been green and peaceful. The White City prepared for siege, though none could say when it might come or from what quarter the assault would be launched. In Lothlorien, the Lady Galadriel gazed into her mirror and saw the shapes of things that were yet to come. The 3 rings of the elves pulsed with inner fire, their power no longer hidden, but ready to be revealed when the need was greatest. She saw a small figure walking dark paths, with a burden that would test the very foundations of his being, and she wept for the innocence that would be lost before the tale reached its end. But it was in the Shire that hope dwelt most strongly, though its inhabitants knew it not. There in the green hills and flower-filled valleys, a simple folk went about their daily lives in perfect contentment, unaware that one among them carried the fate of the world upon his finger. Bilbo had returned to Bag End with tales that his neighbours dismissed as fantasy. But the ring remained, waiting for the hour when it would claim a new bearer and the final chapter of its story would begin. The wind that blew across Middle-earth carried with it the whisper of prophecy, the promise of endings and new beginnings. The Third Age drew toward its close, and though darkness gathered like storm clouds upon every horizon, there remained in the hearts of the free peoples a light that no shadow could extinguish. For hope is the most precious of all treasures, and it dwells not in the halls of kings, but in the courage of simple folk who choose to stand against the night. Thus ended the tale of the haunted towers of Weathertop, though in truth it was only the beginning of a greater story yet to be told.